It was I think in the back of the Arlo Old Town, in the dressing room, which was a sink and a freezer. And Steve had been over to this place I started singing in the Fifth Peg, but I don't think I met him over there. He come over with Fred and Eddie Holstein and to kind of check me out, but I ended up playing at Earl's, and I'd heard Steve on the radio on the Midnight Special. Radio program was a folk music program on this station in Chicago on Saturday nights, and I heard him singing the city of New Orleans, and I just got this vision of that the guy singing that song wore like turtleneck sweaters and had really kind of a crew cut and maybe a little beard, and really tall guy, you know. And here comes this guy storming through the door, looks like Edward G. Robinson, and walks up to me and says, "Hi, I'm Steve Goodman," you know, and "You're all right," like previous to that I wasn't, you know. He was like solidifying it, you know, and we became kind of instant friends.
In 1971, I worked for an agency in New York, CMA, which is now ICM, and we would have Monday morning meetings where there'd be a lot of nothing going on, and there were like 25 agents on the 30th floor, and our boss had we would have a certain agenda where we discuss all new acts, Manhattan Transfer, Bette Midler. And these were all brand new artists. And on the docket came an artist by the name of John Prine and Steve Goodman. And they'd just been signed to the agency. And that's the first day I heard his name.
I met Steve Goodman back around 1971, and I was playing in a club at the time on Belmont called Quiet Night. And one night after the show, I was walking out with my guitars, you know, going home or to the hotel or something, and the owner of the place, a guy named Richard Harding, stopped me and said, "Arlo, before you go, a friend of mine wants to sing you a song." So I said, "Oh, come on, man, I don't want to hear no songs. I don't like songs. I was tired. I said, I don't even like my songs. Why should I listen to other people's songs?" So around the corner comes this little guy, and he's smiling at me, and he says, "Arlo, I just want to sing you one song, man." So I says, "Okay, I tell you what, man, you buy me a beer, and I'll sit here and drink it. And as long as it lasts, you can do whatever you want." So he says, "That sounds like a good deal." And I says, "It does." And it turned out to be one of the finer beers of my life. I met Steve Goodman that night, and we sat down, and he played a bunch of songs, and he gave me a tape of some of his stuff and some lead sheets, and I took them home. And within about 6 months or so, we had recorded City of New Orleans and went on from there.
I first remember meeting, Stevie said that we met when I was playing with Lester Flatt when I was a teenager, and he was out on the college campus tour. But I really locked souls with Stevie Goodman when I was playing in Johnny Cash's band. And somehow or another, Johnny Cash had John Prine and Stevie and Rodney Crowell come up to Washington to do an HBO special. And that's when I really hooked up with Goodman and saw what a complete lunatic he was. I loved Stevie from moment one. And we just went on to be buddies after that.
The kind of music that John Prine and Steve Goodman did and do was never the pedestrian choice, you know. It was never the type of music that everyone wanted to be a part of. Don't forget David Bowie was happening, and Poco. It was real melodic. The Eagles were just starting out. I just knew that I loved them as people, and that the music was so quality, and they were quality guys and could back it up. So you have to bet on that.
I couldn't believe that Steve Goodman, during his shining hour, like, you know, instead of standing there going, "Thanks a lot," when they were telling him that they thought he was, you know, wrote great songs and he should do something about it, as in, like, maybe, you know, think about getting a recording contract or make a record of them. And instead he goes, "If you think I'm good," you know, like that. And he hustles them into a cab, Kris, Samantha Eggers, and Paul Anka. And takes him across town to see. It was payday for me. It was Sunday night. I used to play Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and a matinee on Sunday afternoon, and then 3 shows on Sunday night. Earl was a really great employer. And I was waiting around for my pay. And it was the waitresses and a couple of guys at the bar and the cook and the dishwasher and me. And I'm just waiting because we get paid in cash, even though I reported it. And here I get a phone call from Goodman. Don't go anywhere. I'm bringing Kris Kristofferson over with some other people to hear you. And at the time, like, what Kris was doing was, geez, it was like, for what we were trying to do, like Kris was doing already. Like, he was writing these songs that, I don't know, it just kind of brought everything together, like country music and folk music and all this stuff. And it was Kris's shining hour too. And here they turned to Goodman and go, "Hey, you write great songs." And instead of going thanks, he goes, "Let me take you across town to see my buddy." So I didn't care that the chairs were up on the tables. Like all of a sudden, I was like, you know, I was dancing, like, you know, going. I got up and sang about maybe, I don't know, maybe 7 songs or so, because I wasn't sure how long they wanted to be held up for. And I got off the stage, and Kris asked me to go back and sing the same songs and sing anything else I got, you know. And so I did, you know, and it was an amazing night, you know. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but even more amazing was when Steve and I came here, because I remember some of the things in between, but that was the logical next step. Like, you know, when Steve talked me into going to New York City by saying, I said, "I don't know if I want to go or not." And he goes, "You ever been to New York?" And I says, "No." And he says, "Well." So we took the plane tickets and ran with it, you know.
Well, I met Steve when we were playing the Quiet Night in Chicago. I can't remember the year even what it was, but it must have been about 70 or 71 when we worked 2 shows a night every night for about 18 months, and I was pretty brain damaged at the time. But Steve was opening for us at the Quiet Night, and I was so tired that I usually didn't even go in there until it was time for my show, you know. And the guys in the band said, "You ought to hear this guy. He's really good." And he was. And he had 2 songs that knocked me out, particularly. One was City of New Orleans, which I tried to pitch to Johnny Cash, and he'll admit it today, he blew it. And the other was Sam Stone. And he said, you gotta meet the guy that wrote this song. And I was, you know, we were doing 2 shows a night, and every night, and roaring after that, you know, and wiped out. And we never got a chance to hear him. And it was the last night of the week that we were at the Quiet Night. And Paul Anka had come over because he was working in town and in some fancy club, and he was singing a song of mine then, "Help Me Make It Through the Night." And he anyway, he came over to see us in this club. It was kind of slumming, you know, and he was knocked out with Steven. And Steve said, "Who you got to hear is my friend who wrote Sam Stone." So we went over to the Quiet Night after my last show, and I think it was Samantha Egger was with us. And we had to wake up Steve. The club was closed. I mean, we had to wake up John. He was asleep in one of the booths. And all the chairs were up on the tables, and he got up, and I had this moment of compassion for him, you know, thinking what this kid must be thinking getting up in front of a couple of strangers, you know, showing your stuff. He proceeded to sing Sam Stone, Paradise, Donald and Lydia, Hello in There. Absolutely destroyed us. One after another, Spanish Pipe Dream. It was the most incredible thing. I get chills thinking about it today. And it was such a thrill. Anyway, we went back to Paul Anka's penthouse, and we were upstairs, and he said he asked Steve and John if he bought him a ticket, would they go to New York, where I happened to be playing at the bitter end next week. And Steve said, would you like to see a short, fat Jewish kid dive in a bowl of chicken? Which was nearby. There was a big bowl of chicken. Anyway, he bought him a ticket, and they showed up here when I was playing. And so I went up to Paul Colby, the owner, and asked him if I could put him on my show, because we were doing 2 shows a night, and I think he said I could put one of them, but I couldn't put 2 of them on. And eventually he gave in, and we had 2 shows. Jerry Wexler came over, because he came over with his wife to see Donnie Fritz, who was his friend in my band. And he sent his wife home and stayed for the 2nd show, and Paul let us virtually close the doors on the rules and let us stay open as long as we want to. And they never looked back.
Steve was performing one night at the bitter end after he had gotten his deal. That was another thing. I was responsible for places like the Fillmore East, the bitter end. I was in charge of booking all of my artists into those facilities. Well, I went down to see Stevie early, sound check, just to meet him, because the other agent wasn't going. And I'll never forget it. Stevie was standing right in front of the bitter end, outside, under where his name was advertised in very small print, and he had these big round brown eyes. And the minute I got out of the car, the cab, I looked at him, he looked at me, and as corny as it sounds, I knew right then and there that we would be. First of all, he looked like he could have been my brother, a very young version of me. And right then and there, we knew, you know, that we would work together for a long time.
Some people, you know, you have to really work at getting to know who they are. You didn't have to do that with Steve Goodman. You knew who Steve Goodman was just by looking at him. And that was a very nice feature. He wasn't hiding anything. He was who he is. He had he had the kind of face and the kind of eyes that just sort of was bigger than life. And just, he had a lot of life. For somebody who was sick, he had an awful lot of life in him. And he had a boundless energy, almost like too much. And he put it to the best use I've seen with people with too much energy.
Steve can pick like a jazz player, you know. It was an extension of him, like Picasso's paintbrush was an extension of his fingers.
I always said it. He was the guy that was on the edge of the room. I don't care. You could put him on the show with Dylan or Tony Bennett or Steppenwolf or Johnny Cash, and he would look for that one deal, that one little slant. He was the guy on the edge of the room looking at it like this, where he could go through and steal the show. And 9 times out of 10, he did it.
John McEwen was opening up shows for Steve Martin in his early stage of his career. And Steve Martin started to get real hot. And he had suggested, rather than himself, to put on this guy by the name of Steve Goodman, who was incredible for that kind of audience, because Steve Martin grew to, you know, 20,000 people.
He played so well, and he was such a great entertainer, and so quick, and so just right there all the time, you know. And he was that kind of guy. He's not like everybody else. He was really different. You know, you can say that about everybody to some extent, But when you put them all in a room somewhere and you look, and you just go through the line of who's looking like, you could always pick out Goodman.
Well, most of them were afraid to have him open the shows because he'd go after your throat. He'd do 300%.
Every audience was his. If you think his job was hard, what do you think it was like following him? I put him on stage so many times after that, I quit doing it finally, because the critics keep saying, Jesus, you know, this guy blows Kristofferson off the stage. And of course, that was the intention when you put a guy on the show. You don't want him to bomb. But following Steve was like following Jerry Lee Lewis or something, you know. I would rather not do it.
It was a cartoon. He was like this incredible ball of fire that can do anything with a guitar. And he was the same guy off stage as he was on stage.
Stevie got me as a picker. See, I come from the South. I'm a Southern kid. And Stevie had knowledge of the South and everywhere else as far as player styles went. But he had this Chicago slant. He had that ragtime thing about him. He really had a cool thing on the blues. He was definitely folky. So running into Steve was like running into a whole nother world for me.
Well, he called me every time he got an idea for a song. Usually, it wasn't a long period of time between Steve getting an idea for a song and it becoming an actual song. And he'd just call up in the middle of the night or morning or whenever, wherever he was on the road, and he'd just go, Johnny. And I go, Steve? Like, you know, and he'd go, got one. And he'd sit the phone down and sing the song to me. And then I'd go, hey, that's great, and he'd hang up. You know, like that was it, but he wanted me to know that a new song existed, like, you know.
I think the nice thing about Steve's songs were some people write one kind of song, but he wrote all kinds of songs. He wrote these ballads, he wrote sad songs, he wrote happy songs, he wrote funny songs, he was just like writing, I mean, wasn't restricted to any particular variety of songs.
Pete Seeger told me one time about Woody Guthrie. He said Woody always wrote from a man on a boxcar's perspective as the observer going through the world. And I think Stevie had a lot of that quality about him. Stevie was definitely, he could write a commercial song with a funny turn and, you know, a commercial twist to it. But the stuff that I like of Stevie's is the stuff like City of New Orleans, where he really was the man, you know, taking notes as he went through life.
Would you like to learn to dance? Chokes me up today. And of course, the city of New Orleans is, it's going to live forever, you know. When you get a song that so many people can make their own song. I'm still laughing at Johnny Cash for turning that down. He thought people were trying to typecast him as a trained singer.
Steve Goodman, of course, wrote so many great songs, but the classic City of New Orleans, when he performed, he'd sing that song and never say that he wrote it. And it was like, I'd say, Steve, nobody knows you wrote that. I don't know who. And we could use analogies with each other. That was never management-artist relationship. It was brothers. It was a relationship of busting each other. I mean, it wasn't one of like, you know, enabling or pacifying the situation. And I'd say, hey, Steve, I don't know if you get this, but no one knows you wrote it. No one knows who you are. They think not only that they don't know who you are, but you're copying Arlo Guthrie's song. You should tell them. And he could never get that. Like, he was shocked by that.
We were on the train going down to visit my 93-year-old grandmother in Mattoon. And I mean, it's a nice train, but there's not a lot going on a train ride. And after a while, he just started scribbling. But I remember he always wore really scruffy clothes, and he had these blue jeans on with big holes in the knees. And we got down to Mattoon, and that's all my grandmother could talk about was the holes in his jeans. We went there and back, and he hadn't written the song completely, but I know we got off the train and went straight to the Earl, because he had to share, I mean, whenever there was a new song, he had to find someone to share it with. In fact, if I wasn't with him, along with John, I'd get calls from the road. And we went straight to the Earl and to the back, and he was playing it for someone on the freezer. And somebody suggested that the song really wasn't finished because he didn't talk about anything right in the car. So he added that verse, and it was done. So it was really written in one day.
We tried to do all kinds of things to it in the studio. We tried it upbeat, we tried it this way, we tried it slow, we tried it sideways, we tried it bluegrass, we tried it, you know, we actually recorded it from scratch 7 times. I mean, I don't mean just trying to fix an old way, actually just worked it, threw it out, worked it, threw it out. And on the 7th time, we ended up with just this very simple, plaintive, little piano, little guitar, little squeeze box. And we had some wonderful singers, the Blackberries, and a group of guys that could really sing. And between the simple tune and the instrumentation and the vocals, it just became an anthem, you know, in and of itself.
So Steve and I, in a short amount of time, returned to New York quite a few times. We're staying at the Hotel Roosevelt, sharing a room. And the rooms there are really small and quaint. I kept my beer in the bathtub. That's something else my dad taught me. That's the way you could keep it cold. And like Steve would go, what about showers, you know, and stuff, you know. But I walk in, one night I want to go out in the town. I came down to the village to see whoever was down here. And Steve stayed back at the hotel. And I come in the room, our room, and Steve is sitting by the desk that they put in hotel rooms, and the only light on is right over there, and he's actually using the desk for what it's supposed to be used for. He's sitting there writing, you know. And I look over his shoulder and it says, "It was all that I could do to keep from crying. Sometimes it seems so useless to remain," right? And I jumped up on the bed and started playing an imaginary fiddle. And I went, "You don't have to call me darling, darling, but you never even call me by my name." And we started laughing. And then Steve sat and wrote the whole rest of the song, except for the last verse, the one that made the song. The one about dogs and mothers and prisons and everything. But we more or less wrote the song like we were just making fun of the whole thing, you know, the whole idea that he was writing a serious country song. And Steve ended up turning it around and putting that ultimate verse on it, you know. And when he got all done with it and told me he was going to record it, I said, "Are you kidding?" I said, "That song's terrible." You know, and he said, "What do you mean terrible?" I said, "Well, it makes fun of country music." I was young and sensitive. And I said, "It makes fun of country music." You know, I said, so I didn't put my name on it. And next thing I know, David Allan Coe records it and becomes a #1 country single. You know, and Steve called up when it was going #1 and says, "Now do you want your name on it?" And I says, "Oh no, you're like, I'm a man of my word, you know." I said, "No, I don't want it on there." So the next day, Steve pulls up in a pickup truck and gives me this $12,000 Wurlitzer jukebox from 1942, a Victory model. It still doesn't run, but it looks really good, you know. And it sits in my living room. And every time I look at that jukebox, I feel really stupid.
Steve never was wrong in anything he ever did. And he wouldn't say I was wrong. In fact, we were in Italy one time, in Rome. I'll never forget it. And I really leaned on Steve as this well-read guy, this guy who had been to school and really knew so much. He was a Renaissance man. I thought he was this incredible Renaissance man. So we were in St. Peter's Chapel, or St. Peter's Cathedral. And Steve, we were walking around looking at the Mosaic period, looking at all these wonderful, wonderful artists. And and he'd say, Steve, there's a Botticelli. Would say, Al, there's a Michelangelo, and he would go on describing the pain of these artists, laying on their backs, doing this work. Went on for hours discussing the Mosaic periods and who did it. Well, I'm like in awe of this guy, you know, and Steve was 5'2", and we'd walk around. I was in awe of his knowledge, his vast knowledge of art, wines, foods. Well, around the bend comes this tour, a bunch of Americans with this guide. And he's standing right on the way we had just left. And his read on who did those paintings were different than Steve's read. I said, Steve, what have you been telling me? This guy is saying something altogether different. He said, that guy is wrong. I said, Steve, he gets paid to do it. It's happening in 3 different languages as he does it. He's reading. He said, Al, he's wrong. I said, Steve, he's not wrong. We walk up to the guide, and Steve says, I think you're wrong. And the guy looked at him and couldn't speak enough English to kind of argue with Steve. Well, anyway, we walked away knowing the guy was wrong, and Stevie, of course, was right. He wanted to put out a record on his own label, and that we should start a label. And just for the record now, on camera, it was Steve Goodman's idea to start a record, not mine. I mean, I didn't want to start a label. It was difficult enough.
The idea of the record company is very, very exciting, you know, and I mean, I knew Steve could always do whatever he wanted to do. I mean, he'd say, I'm going to do this, and you go, well, of course.
I would walk through the audience confiscating tapes from people, just taking them, because they had no right to record. And I always saved. I was never a saver of anything, but I did save tapes on Stevie. So I had this closet full of tapes. So my friend and now partner, Dan Einstein, he and I would go down, we'd close the office on Friday, go down to Steve's house, and just assemble this record, this group of songs to put out a record, and more or less pacifying Stevie. We didn't think too much was going to happen with it, and we certainly didn't have a place to sell them. There was no outlet for them.
We started out basically doing the mail order from the apartment. We kept records in the garage and the packing cases, and the girls would help, and we'd sit around the table and wrap it up and label things and get it out. But Steve's big pleasure was stacking them in the shopping cart and rolling them down to the little tiny post office station there. And the guys there knew him, and we're always glad to see him, and he'd chat and talk about it. So it was really sort of a nice mom and pop kind of thing.
People who wrote about Steve, we had asked them to do, at least give us a little piece, whether they liked it or not, of where people, a little space where people can get the record. And we started selling records. I'll never forget, I think $6 or $7 the first records were. And it was Stevie's idea and his spirit that started the company. And then that grew into what we know today as Red Pajamas Records.
From the time he got sick, I think that what made him really tick is this need to accomplish a life and things that he wanted to do, and it was all so it was all intensified. But I think he wanted to say something about the things he saw around him, and he wanted to enjoy those things and kind of make a difference. Make a difference, whether it was musically or whatever, for the people he cared about.
There's a poem that I can't even think of who the author is. It's kind of it's a story of he's a South American writer, but he's talking about this guy who said in the town of Nigua in Colombia, there's a man who can climb into the sky, and he told what it looked like on the earth from his point of view up there, and he said we're a sea of tiny flames. Each flame is got its own light, and no two flames are alike, and they're flames of every color, and they're still flames, and some foolish flames don't give light or heat, but there are some that blaze with life so furiously that you can't look at them without blinking. And if you approach, you shine with fire. And that's the way Steve was. He was a very positive force every place he was. Johnny Cash took him on the road with him when he was bald as a baby, and I've never seen him in a place where he didn't just brighten the room.